Here we're going to talk about the early years of Francis Crick and his involvement in science at an early age. So as you can see right there, we have a picture of a dude. That's Walter Drawbridge Crick. That was Francis Crick's grandfather, who was a scientist himself, actually. He was an amateur naturalist who wrote a survey of single-cell protists and worked with Darwin. He also had two slugs named after himself, so this way of thinking surrounded Francis at a young age. His uncle, Walter Crick, named after his grandfather, also taught Francis how to go about conducting his own experiments. He taught him the process of scientific experimentation, which really led to a peak in interest, which also caused him to rapidly intake scientific literature at massive amounts. Whatever he could get his hands on, he was reading, which led to him rejecting religion. His parents were religious folk, and he felt that the science just did not back religion, so he declared himself an atheist and left the church. Well, it's not safe to say that they're hobbies. Crick did possess a few skills taught to him by his uncle Walter Crick in his earlier years, such as glass blowing and making photographic prints. You can see that guy blowing some glass over there, and you can see that the process was extremely hands-on and super involved, and it's safe to say it still is, so it kind of demonstrates his desire to just really get his hands on stuff. He was also at one point extremely invested in physics and a huge advocate of atheism. So, actually, to begin with, Francis studied physics at the University College London. So he graduated in 1937 with a Bachelor of Science, and he actually wanted to get his PhD in the viscosity of water, but unfortunately he was interrupted by World War II, where he was enlisted by the military to do some research for the Admiralty. As I had mentioned before, Crick had earned his Bachelor of Science in Physics at the University College of London. However, following the war and supported by a scholarship, he studied and earned his PhD in biology at Cambridge in the Strangeway Research Laboratory before moving on to the Cavendish Laboratory, where he and his research partner, James Watson, studied the structure of DNA. Right there, we have a nice picture of Cambridge. So, as I mentioned before, Crick had been enlisted by the military to do some research on the development of magnetic and acoustic mines, which was relevant at the time to the war, and it was, it had to do with physics as he had been studying at University College London. But during this time, he was very caught up in Erwin Schrödinger's What is Life? As you can see that picture right there, Erwin Schrödinger and What is Life? This actually really heavily influenced his decision to swap his studies from physics to biology. By the end of the war, he was even invited to stay researching physics for the military, but he was bored with physics and he felt a greater interest in biology. He felt that calling, so he decided to make the swap. Uh, when he went to Cambridge, he studied the structure of DNA with James Watson, as I had mentioned before, and by 1953, they had released a scientific paper called The Structure for Deoxyribose Nucleic Acid. They had uncovered the structure of DNA, which had never been done before. Nobody knew what DNA looked like at this point, so this was a huge deal. And later on in life, he became actually very interested in neuroscience and the human condition and what it meant to be human and what it meant to be conscious. So, as you might have guessed by now, Crick is actually a molecular biologist, but he's also a biophysicist, as this incorporates his heavy studies in physics in the past. But his research was largely dependent on the structure of DNA, as by the mid-1900s, we still had no idea what it is DNA looked like, and there were several proposals of the structure, but Crick and his partner James Watson were the ones to suggest the double helical structure and the chemistry behind what allowed for the double helical structure to maintain its shape. Um, Later on in life, he worked with a German-American scientist by the name of Christoph Koch, and they took part in major studies on human consciousness, as they were curious as to how and why the brain responded to stimuli and why there were small discrepancies in each individual. Together, in 2003, they released a scientific paper by the name of Framework for Consciousness. Right here, we have a picture of Crick and Watson and their model of the double helical structure of DNA. The most recent scientific paper that Crick was involved in was actually published in 2003 by the title of A Framework for Human Consciousness, where he worked with a German-American neuroscientist named Christoph Koch. We have a picture of Dr. Koch there. And this was kind of an interesting paper as no experiments were actually performed within this short paper, rather theories of how human brains visually perceive experiences were proposed. These theories focused on neuron firing, neuron layer, and neuron connections. So, some of Crick's biggest obstacles perhaps were turning from his life of religious beliefs to his newfound life of science, and later on turning from physics to biology, of which he knew very little about. So, I truly admire Crick's ability to go for what it is he really wants and is interested in. He studied physics for so long, and he was even offered a job post wartime by the military to continue his research in physics. Yet he turned that down in favor of his curiosity in biology. It's also extremely bold of him to proclaim his atheism to his religious parents in the early 1900s. Whether one is religious or not, you'd have to acknowledge that that must have been a really hard thing for someone to do at that time period. But that's just the way that Crick was. He was bold, unafraid, and he was determined. So, Crick left behind quite the legacy of discovery as when he was working with Watson, not only did they discover the double helical structure of DNA, but they also theorized that DNA split apart to perform some sort of replication process in order to create a new strand, which is correct and is especially important in mitosis. And this also led to him discovering the idea of chromosomes, or kind of uncovering the idea, which is also extremely important in regards to mitosis. And as far as his later on research, while he did not do any experiments or discover anything necessarily, his theories that he proposed on human consciousness might be very important to the person who finally does uncover the condition of human consciousness, just like in the 1950s, where he and Watson had discovered the structure of DNA. They had many proposals to read through and build off of and give them ideas. So who knows, his stuff might actually serve the same purpose to someone else. And as far as the next steps go, Crick is dead. There will be no next steps for him, but another scientist may come along and build off of his work, especially in the neurological area, as there's so little that we actually know about the human brain.